Well, it's time now to have a look at the Sunday papers, and to review them with me this morning is broadcaster and writer Gemma Forty and the entrepreneur Kate Hardcastle. There they are. Good morning to you both looking fantastic, I must say. Gemma, we're starting with you this morning, the front page of the Sunday Times. A really big story, this, for so many homeowners, and certainly a very significant admission from the government for the first time when it comes to this scandal surrounding cladding.
You're right, it is significant and it is interesting. Why now? Grenfell, that awful tragedy happened in 2017, but today we see that Gove is saying that the government are partially responsible. Now, remember, at the time, it was always, now is not the time, now is not the time. And, you know, that kind of can kicking does mean there's not this immediate demand for culpability when the tragedy is incredibly raw in people's minds. But with Grenfell, it remains raw. It must never happen again. And yet so many people are still trapped, essentially, sort of almost imprisoned in homes that still have this kind of cladding while the row rumbles on about who should have to pay for the removal of it. So I wonder perhaps why now are the results of an inquiry going to be incredibly damning on the government? Is this damage control? People will be perhaps glad that this has finally been admitted, but it was also sort of obvious probably at the time that these regulations were completely exploited by unscrupulous builders, and as the piece says, faulty and ambiguous guidance allowed this to happen. So an awful lot to think about. But another thing just to say is that, you know, building regs, all kinds of regulations are there in place supposedly to protect people. And the government, as recently as this week, have voted to scrap up to 4,000 pieces of regulation at the end of this year, right at the end of this year, under the EU retained law bill, but without any notion at the moment of how they'll be replaced, which could be a worry as well for safety.
Right, interesting stuff, Gemma, and certainly a very significant story for so many thousands of homeowners who've been stuck in limbo for 5 years. Moving on to the front page of the Sunday Telegraph, which also has a pretty big story, Kate, that you've pulled out. Plans to create these virtual wards in people's homes to alleviate, of course, the immense pressure we've seen on the health service this winter.
Any stories talking about the development of e-health, which is the terminology used to talk about any way of bringing technology into the NHS, into medical care, I think is really worth a conversation and interest. And I think this story is actually very interesting. It's cased sometimes with language that talks about this in almost a potentially fearful way. And I just don't think we should look at that. We must embrace the opportunity to create a health service fit for the current climate and beyond. We know that 20% of hospital admissions are avoidable. We know that 1 in 7 beds are currently occupied by someone medically well enough to either be transferred home or in a care home. And we've got to look at the evolvement of this. So the story very much talks about the idea that there would be what it classes as face care, which is via video link. Elderly and frail patients who've been treated for a fall would be done so remotely. Now, of course, that has to be with a huge amount of focus on ensuring that that care is the best care and the support is there. But this has been delivered via trials which have been incredibly successful, and those trials have shown that actually as part of this urgent and emergency care recovery plan, we can start to bring in the best tools available to us to get support. We know the NHS at heart is a wonderful philosophy, but it was built many years ago and it is broken. And what we've got to do is accept positively, if trials have happened and there's positive movement about how we can move this antiquated, aching, creaking ship into a new era that will serve us well and ensure that we don't have ambulance wait times escalating to crazy levels. I think it's a good thing. And if you look at some of the examples of where e-health works really well, Denmark, Estonia, etc., there's some brilliant examples of how we can do even more to get the best care.
Yeah, certainly innovation is desperately needed, Kate. Thanks. And Gemma, something else that's a real headache for the government is this issue of asylum seekers and how they're being processed once they arrive in the UK. And more worrying reports on the front page of The Observer today about children seeking asylum in the UK and what's happening to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Heart-wrenching. Some of these children will have been smuggled across on their own, desperate to be reunited with relatives, very vulnerable, obviously terrified, and then to arrive on these shores and face this horrible treatment that you would not expect from Great Britain. And then this has resulted in many of them being sort of shoved out onto the street, where they are then taken by another set of traffickers to face who knows what. It's absolutely horrific and shameful. And I know that the Home Office are denying this, but it's a very extensive report in The Observer, and it did come up at PMQs last week, and I was absolutely horrified to see the MP, Jonathan Gullis, shouting out, "Well, they deserve it if they're going to come here illegally," which just was one of the most ignorant Neanderthal things I've ever heard an MP say. Just sort of awful. And when that rhetoric is coming down from high-profile MPs, what do you expect? Is that filtering down into how the Home Office and the people that work there think that they can treat other humans? And of course, what would prevent this is safe passage and being able to process people to come here illegally on French shores. And that is something that time and time and time again, this government say they will refuse to look at. And so they haven't solved all their ideas, haven't solved it. We're getting more migrants arrive here than ever, no idea who they are, and then this abysmal treatment at this end. So it's not a great read.
Well, it's interesting you should mention that, Gemma, because actually that very story is on the front page of The Express today. Kate, you've pulled this out. They are indeed trying to ban what they call illegal immigration, these small boat crossings. But Rishi Sunak is under criticism for this, Kate.
Yeah, the story talks very much that we're expecting to see the PM on a collision course, it's described as, with civil servants, as plans to ban illegal migrants it rages on. And senior officials want the PM to tear up the rule book. And at the heart of this, there is a very human issue. And at the heart of this are statistics that actually are not used anywhere near enough, are not clear enough. And when you hear about the rhetoric that Gemma's just talked about, the anguish that's given in 240 characters or less, when we don't have the facts out there clearly enough, and I'm not going to repeat any numbers here today because they're always up for debate, but a very small amount of people in the UK wanting to try and find safety. And the fact that our methodology, both for how we receive those people and then how we treat those people, are just simply not good enough. I hope that the conversation can move on to some reality about what needs to be done to ensure that there is humanity at the core of everything we do, both in terms of receiving people and also dealing with people. And that's the point. This is a human issue.
Absolutely. And very briefly, I think we've got just about time for one more. Gemma, the front page of the Mirror, the Tories' top treasurer is linked to Russia's oil and gas industry. Briefly, more on that.
I mean, imagine Sunak appointing Mohammed Mansour, who's the co-owner of Unitrack, who's donated 600 grand to the Conservatives, and the company has, and he personally has donated 2 million, and their firm are dealing with Putin.
Lovely.
And the stink of corruption, it just is absolutely mind-boggling.
Okay, Gemma, I'm sure that a lot of people have strong views on that, and if you want to read about it in full, that's on the front page of the Mirror. Gemma and Kate, we will see you next hour. Thanks very much. And more on all of today's news at the top of the hour. Stay with us here on Sky News Breakfast.